But you're about to find out if you do not know. This will be a very informative hour, but we only have an hour, and I want to give my speakers as much time as possible, so I will go ahead and introduce them. As a side note, if you have any questions, be sure to write them down because we will be doing a question and answer session at the end. So our first speaker today is Miss Amanda Brooks. She is the Food Safety Director at Harrison Farms. She has been in this role for over 15 years and takes great pride in protecting the crops grown on her family's farm. She received a bachelor's degree in food and nutrition from San Diego State University, then continued her education in dietetics, ultimately becoming a registered dietitian. Amanda serves on several agricultural-related committees and boards, including Arizona's LGMA's Communication and Technical Subcommittees, Yuma Safe Produce Council, Yuma Fresh Vegetable Association, and Yuma Irrigation District. Our second speaker today is Miss Meghan Scott. Meghan Scott is an attorney with the Noble Law Office and has been practicing law for over 11 years. With the Noble Law Office, she represents a number of irrigation districts in the Yuma area and the Barred Water District in California. Additionally, she handles legislative and government affairs for the Yuma Fresh Vegetable Association. She also practices in other areas of law. Ms. Scott was born and raised right here in Yuma, Arizona, and is the daughter of a third-generation Yuma farmer. All right. Let's give it up for Miss Amanda Brooks.
Okay, these lights are bright up here. I'm not used to being on stage. As Miss Taylor said, my name is Amanda Brooks, and I would like to thank her very much for putting this together. Water is something that's very, very important to our community, to agriculture, and anyone that uses Colorado River water. So I think education on the matter is very important, and I just want to thank her for putting this together. Thank you. I want to make a bit of a disclaimer before I dive into my presentation. Water, especially Colorado River water, is a very, very complex issue. One of the flyers I saw that was about today referred to having water experts speaking. And so I just want to say that I don't consider myself a water expert. I strive to be a water expert, but it is such a complex issue that it is so difficult to fully understand it. So what I'm going to be talking about today is about water use, specifically in agriculture. Do you want to click? Yeah, thank you. Okay, you can click. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit of history on the Colorado River. I hope that this paints a picture of water use in agriculture and the efficiencies in how we use it. The Colorado River is often referred to as the most controversial and regulated river in the world. Let's take a look at why. This graph shows flows on the Colorado River dating back over 1,000 years ago. What I want to point out in this graph is that flows fluctuate. For as far back as researchers can look, there have been periods of high flows and low flows on the river. We will come back to this slide later, but as you can see, it goes up and down for over 1,000 years. Let's take a look at some of the dates that are important to Yuma's ag water history. In 1869, John Wesley Powell led a team of 9 men in 4 small wooden boats down the Colorado River and through the Grand Canyon. The purpose of his expedition was to evaluate water resource potential in the region, among other things. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, 3 private ditch companies were hired to develop an irrigation system in Yuma Valley. In 1903, Yuma County Water Users was formed, and it contracted with the newly formed Reclamation Service. In 1902, Reclamation Service was created. It is now known as the Bureau of Reclamation. The Reclamation Service studied potential water development projects in the western states. Shortly after the Reclamation Act was passed, construction on Laguna Dam began. This is the first dam on the Colorado River. Laguna Dam was part of a larger project that included the Yuma Siphon, Yuma Main Canal, and distribution systems. Laguna Dam diverted water off the Colorado River for agricultural purposes. In 1922, the Colorado River Compact was signed. It divided the river into two basins. The upper basin, which consists of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, and the lower basin, which consists of Arizona, California, and Nevada. It established the allotment for each basin and provided a framework for management of the river in years to come. The compact, along with its treaties, is often referred to as the law of the river. The upper basin in this compact would get 7.5 million acre feet of water, and the lower basin would also get 7.5 million acre feet of water. While the compact divided water up into basins, specific allocations for basin states did not come until later, in 1928 as part of the Boulder Canyon Act. The act gave California the largest share of the river with 4.4 million acre feet annually. Arizona got 2.8 million acre feet, and Nevada got 300,000 acre feet. I think it's important to mention that these negotiations were not always easy, and not everyone always agreed. The Boulder Canyon Project authorized the construction of Hoover Dam and Imperial Dam. Imperial Dam is located about 20 miles northeast of Yuma, and it replaced the Laguna Dam as the main diversion point for irrigation water in Yuma. It also made the Gila Project possible, which diverted Colorado River water to farms east of Yuma that had previously been using water from the Gila River and groundwater sources. In 1944, the Mexican Treaty allocated 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico. Go ahead. So let's take another look at this graph. When the compact was signed, remember, that's when the water in the Colorado River was divided up. It was at the highest flows on record. The black dot at the top of the screen over here, that's when the compact was signed, and you can see that it's the highest point on this graph at about 20 million acre feet. Next slide, please. So this is another graph that shows water supply and use since the compact was signed. Again, on the far left, you can see the blue line is water supply, and that is at the peak, at 20 million acre feet. And every year since the compact was signed, it has failed to reach that level. Since the year 2000, inflows have been below 15 million acre feet. On the right of this graph, it shows the projected supply and demand. What does this mean? The river is over-allocated. It means the river is over-allocated and there is more water going out than is coming in. Between 2000 and 2020, the average flows in the river were 12.4 million acre feet. A simple math problem will tell you the river is over-allocated, but it actually gets much worse than that, because none of what is written on this slide includes things like system losses and evaporation, which is believed to be about 1.5 million acre feet annually. You can see the red line at the bottom shows a deficit of at least 4.1 million acre feet. It should come as no surprise that levels in our two biggest reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, are dropping and causing serious concern for all users on the Colorado River. Now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about water use in agriculture. Much like the last 100 years of development on the Colorado River, Yuma area farmers have been developing their farms to be the most efficient users of water in the Colorado River Basin. It started even before John Wesley Powell's first trip down the river, before there was a Bureau of Reclamation, and before Arizona was even a state. The first settlers came here on the promise of cheap land and water. The fields didn't look like they look today. They had to clear and level the fields and dig their own ditches to get water. Many farms in the Yuma area today are operated by fourth and fifth generation farmers. The hard work and perseverance of each generation has led to the most productive and reliable ag systems in the world. Click one more time. Oh, sorry, that slide didn't work right. It was supposed to show you what farms looked like today and what farms looked like back then. Prior to a seed even being planted, the soil is prepared specifically for the crop being planted. The bed size, the irrigation method, and other things that go into growing a crop. All the fields in Yuma are leveled with GPS equipment. They are dead level. This means no runoff like in other agricultural areas. Every drop of water that is put on the soil goes straight into the ground. Go ahead, Megan. Planting and transplanting. Seed varieties take years to create and have very precise windows that maximize yields. Varieties are also bred for resistance to soil and pest-borne diseases. Transplants are grown in greenhouses, and they use much less input than if a seed was planted in the ground. Yuma agriculture utilizes different methods of irrigation. Flood irrigation can be used to leach salts from the soil, making the soil more productive for salt-sensitive crops such as lettuce, which is one of the biggest commodities we grow in Yuma. Sprinklers reduce the overall use of water by targeting seeds during germination and for crops with shallow roots. Drip irrigation water is applied directly to the root zone of the crop and is becoming more popular in the Yuma area for water conservation. Other growing practice, such as weeding and thinning crops, includes the removal of unwanted plants so that plants that you want to grow in the field have more space and can grow uniformly. Weeds are plants that are not the crop you are trying to grow. Weeds can affect how the crop grows and uses resources like water and fertilizer that are intended for the crop. Another common use is the use of bolos. In this picture, it's the silver wheel that's behind the tractor. This is a practice that compacts the soil and helps the water travel to the end of the furrow quickly. This allows for even distribution of water. Thank you. None of the food we grow can be harvested or sold if it is not safe. When farmers experience food safety problems, they have to buffer or destroy those crops that are affected. Having strong food safety practices ensures that we can harvest all of a crop. Crop protection is the practice of managing plant diseases, pests, and weeds. Crops are exposed to many factors, and a plant disease or pest can wipe out a field if not managed properly. Science and technology have made farmers better at all of the things that I have already mentioned. Yuma farmers have worked closely with researchers over the years to improve the use of our natural resources, conserve water, build strong food safety programs, fight plant diseases and pests, and find other ways to improve agriculture. Saving water is in everything we do on the farm. There is not one single practice that I can point to and say, this is how we save water. Saving water is in every practice, from the way we prep the soil to the way we shape the beds, plant the seeds, grow the crop, all the way through harvest. Is a well thought out plan to maximize yields and increase quality and safety while decreasing inputs like water that we need. Thank you. Yuma farmers are using less water to grow more crops than ever before. If we were not as efficient, we would need to plant significantly more fields and use more water to get the same amount of food. So Ellie had also asked me to talk a little bit about what the impacts of losing water would be. Food security is the ability to source and afford food. Food security will decrease if we lose water in Yuma County because there will be less food available and it will be more expensive. There are 34 million people in the country that suffer from food insecurity. That number is already too high. Farmers still have bills to pay and will affect their ability to stay in business. Local businesses that supply goods and services to agriculture will also suffer. And in turn, our entire community will suffer. The Colorado River is life to everyone in those basin states, and we all need to do our part. Thank you. You want me to do yours, or do you think?
I think I can do it.
Okay.
We'll see if I can do it. Okay, so Amanda touched on sort of agriculture, water use, and efficiencies and things like that. And I'm going to sort of talk about water in the Yuma area, where it comes from, how we use it, and then also talk sort of about the legal side of things and what that looks like when the Bureau of Reclamation and states start to make decisions about where water might be reduced. So in Yuma, we sort of have three sources of water. Colorado River water, which is a surface water. In order to use that, you have to have a contract, you have to have a present perfected right, a reservation, or a decreed right. And those are all fancy legal terms, but it essentially means that someone has to give you permission to use that water. We also have groundwater in the Yuma area, and in order to be able to use that groundwater, you have to own the land above it. So if you own the land above it, you can most of the time put in a well and pump that water and use it. The other thing to know about our area is that depending on where you put your well, they may consider you to be pumping Colorado River water. And again, in order to do that, you have to have this special right to use that water. So depending on where you're at and where you're trying to pump groundwater, you could possibly be regulated by the Bureau of Reclamation, or simply you're asking the state for permission to drill that well and pump that water, and you're okay to do so. The other source that we have is effluent or reuse. So the city of Yuma does create effluent water. And in order to use that water, you have to be the entity that actually treated that water to the quality that it is. In the Yuma area, we put that water back into the river as a return flow, which means that water that we took out, we used it, we treat it to the highest quality, we put it back in the river, and that water goes toward meeting the United States obligations to Mexico. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So those are the three types of water that we have in the Yuma area. So some of the biggest water users in the area are the city of Yuma. So probably a lot of you get your water from the city. Yuma County The state of Arizona has lands in the Yuma area, so they have water uses. The federal government, the military, the Marine Corps base, Yuma Proving Ground. We also have environmental requirements, and so state and federal agencies may have a right to use water to meet certain environmental needs. And then Amanda talked a lot about agriculture water use. And so for those, a lot of that water use is sort of regulated or controlled by irrigation districts. And then others are simply present perfected rights, and so they can divert that directly from the river. So for agriculture use in particular, most of that water use is just surface water, so water that comes out of the Colorado River. It's managed by those irrigation districts that I mentioned, and there's also an association here, the Yuma County Water Users Association. They are different than districts in that they are not managed, sort of controlled by state regulation or statutes. They are simply a group of individuals who came together to sort of fund and pay for the operation of their system. So their rights are a little bit different, and I'll talk about that as well. And then there is some groundwater use, but like I said, depending on where they're at, it could still be Colorado River water. This is just a map of our districts in the area, and I'll show you one right after this. This is a good way to show comparison in size. And I'll just note that Bard Water District up at the top is actually in California. But a lot of the farmers that farm here in Yuma also farm in Bard. And so we kind of group them in with us because a lot of their business comes to Yuma. It doesn't come elsewhere. Their crops are processed here. And so we always kind of include them in our maps and our images. And then this, I think, is probably hard to see, and I can show this to anyone that wants to see it up close after, but this is an aerial photo that shows the districts, and you can kind of see a lot of the green squares and things where ag is being produced, and shows you those districts just in another way. Okay, so the law of the river is really unlike anything else when it comes to surface water and groundwater resources. It's really regulated by federal law and contracts. And so there are compacts and statutes and contracts and Supreme Court decisions and international treaties and minutes and all of those documents over the course of time. We put them all together and we call that the law of the river. And so like Amanda said, it's complex. You can't just take one document out and read it and then you understand everything. You have to kind of start at the beginning, read it from the beginning, and then build those things in as you go through that body of law and through those documents. And so it is very complex. People spend a lot of time trying to understand it. And just like when anything is written, right, people think it's open to interpretation. And so one group of people probably thinks one thing, another group thinks something else. That's why we have Supreme Court decisions, because people took it to court. And you will likely see that happen here in the near future as well. Because again, people are going to have different understandings of what we meant when we wrote something however many years ago. So like I said, it's been developed over time. Amanda mentioned the compact. We have the Boulder Canyon Project Act. The big Supreme Court case is Arizona versus California. We have the Mexican Water Treaty. And then we have sort of all of these documents that came after that tell us how the river is going to be operated. And those are things like how much water is going to be released from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, and how much water is going to be released from Lake Mead to be delivered to those that receive their water from there. And so, like I said, very complex. I'm not going to try to explain that all to you because it would take a very long time. So in terms of water rights, there are present perfected rights, and these are the most senior or the oldest rights on the river. They have the highest priority, which means that if we lose water and water is reduced, that these people that hold these present perfected rights are likely to be the ones to receive water under the current law of the river. Politics may change that, but as of now, those that have the oldest, most senior rights would receive water in times of shortage. And then we have reserved or decreed rights. These are usually based on court action or federal legislation, and then contract entitlements. So these are the things that, or these are the types of rights where the Bureau of Reclamation entered into a contract with an individual or an entity. A lot of our irrigation districts have these contract rights. And so those are usually going to be based on how much a district or an entity needs to use that water for whatever that purpose is on the land that it goes to. So all of these different rights are given different priorities. We start at 1, which is those oldest present perfected rights that I just mentioned, and they go all the way to priority 6. And I will just mention that for the last several years, those younger priorities, so priority 6, those rights were given whenever there's extra water in the river, then they can see delivery of that water. We haven't had extra water for quite some time. Priority 5 is also sort of extra water. They've received water up until the last couple years, but in the last couple years, they've been asked to stop using Colorado River water. And then as we move up, depending on what level of shortage we find ourselves in, we may or may not be asked to make a reduction. So currently, priority 4 water users, and specifically the Central Arizona Project, has been asked to make reductions to their Colorado River use. For the most part, they've agreed to these ahead of time. So one of the most recent sort of documents that's part of the law of the river was the drought contingency plan. And so Central Arizona Project, knowing that they are one of the most junior users on the river, they made agreements to leave so much water in the reservoir each year in those times of shortage. And so they're doing that sort of voluntarily, but also in a mandatory way. But those reductions are being made now. And as we move forward in time, like I said, others that hold those priority 4 rights and possibly even priority 3 and 2 rights would see reductions depending on how things work out from a drought and water standpoint. So this is just a table that shows you all of the irrigation districts, how much water they have, and then their priority. And if you look at those priorities in the last column, you'll see that we don't have any 4th priority rights, so we're not sort of immediately threatened, right, in this year in terms of reductions. But we do have priority 3 entitlement holders. I didn't put their dates in here, but the other thing to understand is that within each priority, you're given your date that you first started using water. And just like the other priorities, the oldest within that group of water rights is going to be the last one to see a reduction. So if you have the youngest date within that group, then you will see a reduction first before others. And we do have a district that has sort of younger rights within the priority 3 group of rights. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but everybody's entitlement or their water right is based off of a certain calculation. So with consumptive use, that's based off of how much water you actually need to use in the instance of agriculture, how much water you need to use to grow your plants. And so you're given an amount and allowed to use that within the district boundaries. And a lot of times that number is based off how many acres are within the district. And then beneficial use is a little bit different because you're not limited. So as long as you can use water in a beneficial way, you're allowed to have as much water as you could want. And I mentioned that the association in the Yuma area, the Yuma County Water Users Association, they have a different right. They have this beneficial use right. And so on paper, they are not limited in how much water they can use as long as they are putting it to good use. So we do kind of put a number on their use for water accounting purposes, but legally they're not limited to that. Okay. So drought impacts. Currently, the operation of the river is regulated or guided by interim guidelines, the 2007 interim guidelines and the drought contingency plan that I just mentioned. So those two documents currently guide operations of the river. And they both require that certain reductions or contributions to the system will be made depending on the levels at Lake Mead and also on the levels in Lake Powell. And these mostly regulate the lower basin states. So the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that the upper basin, the only thing that really regulates them is that the Bureau of Reclamation can force them in some ways to make sure that they're meeting their delivery obligations to the lower basin. So Amanda mentioned in her presentation that the lower basin gets 7.5 million acre feet and Mexico gets 1.5 million acre feet. And so the upper basin has to make sure that that 7.5 million acre feet gets delivered to the lower basin. That's about the extent of regulation on the upper basin. Reclamation has a lot of input into how the lower basin is operated, and I can't tell you why any of us agree to that or what that looked like, but that's where we're at. So these reductions and the contributions that are made under those plans are done so in line with the priority system. So again, like we talked about, right, oldest rights get their water for as long as they can, and junior users have to give that up. And so currently under those two documents, Yuma doesn't see any reductions. So we don't see any reductions to our ag use, and we don't see any reductions to sort of our municipal or industrial uses. So those are things like city water, right, where you get your water if you live within the city boundaries. And, you know, depending on where you're at, right, your water either comes from the Colorado River or you may be using groundwater. But we don't currently see any reductions. So currently, the Bureau of Reclamation in real time is going through a process to look at all of those requirements and regulations and reductions and contributions, and looking at those to see what more we have to do to make sure that the Colorado River doesn't go dry. And it's very complex, right? And so part of it is science, part of it's looking at hydrology and modeling and looking at what water has come in and out in the last 30 years. And so there's a lot of science behind that. There's a lot of looking at impacts to the environment and whether or not there's going to be enough water in the system for our fish and our animals and all of those things. So that comes into play as well. And then the other part of it is just human need, right? People have different opinions about that, right? There's kind of this group of people that says, you have this much water, when it goes away, you don't have that, you should have been looking for other things. And then there's others that say, well, maybe in some circumstances we need to make sure that certain areas have water no matter what. And so that's going to be one of the bigger, I think, discussion points as we move forward. But the government will have to look at that. They will have to look at those human rights and figuring out whether or not people are going to have water to live, right? And then tribal rights go on top of that. And so the federal government has a special obligation to tribes to make sure that they have the water they need on their reservations. So all of those things are going to go into that process. They have to look at all of it. They have to analyze it. And once they go through that process, they will come out and, there's two paths. There's one where reclamation comes out and tells us what we're all going to do. And the other path is where all of the basin states come together and say, this is what we propose we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. Sort of everyone signs on. And if the Bureau thinks that that's enough, then that's the path that we take. So we can kind of go either direction with that. And I would say that both of those processes are going on at the same time. So the Bureau is doing its job and looking at everything, and the basin states and the water users in those states are kind of doing their job to figure out if they can come to an agreement on their own. So that's where we're at with that. The Bureau is going to, well, I should say, they say that they will have a draft of their plan in April. And then because it's a public process, there's an opportunity for the public to tell them how they got it wrong or how they got it right and where they should maybe change that. And once they've taken all of that in, then they come out with a final decision, and that is what's going to dictate what happens. And if the basin states come up with something in between, then maybe the Bureau works that into their plan. If we don't, then it's up to the Bureau on how we manage the river moving forward. With that being said, based off this idea of a priority system and given our priorities in the Yuma area, if we continue to see the drought that we're seeing and the hydrology that we're seeing, modeling says that we will see instances where Yuma will have to give up water. How significant that looks, it's all unclear, but it could be a very significant amount of water, or it could be small depending on what the system does. So other considerations, we talked about a little bit about Mexico and our obligations to them under the treaty. These obligations have to do with how much water is delivered, how much salt is in that water, so salinity. We have to measure that and mix it and make sure that the water that we're delivering is not full of salt. And then we also have some environmental obligations to Mexico as it goes to delivery of water. The other thing to understand is that all the basin states, we come together, we have these meetings and try to come up with ways to solve the problem. Mexico is another country, and so they're not really part of that process. It's a different process. We have different legal requirements that have to be made. Because it's a treaty, they kind of have to agree that they're going to do certain things. And so how much they're going to contribute when we may be asked to make reductions is still unclear. So as far as the municipal response, we talked a lot about ag today, and that's because Amanda and I, that's what we focus on, right, is protecting agriculture and that way of life, and also, our community through that. But cities and towns are going to have to manage their responses as well, and they're all doing that differently depending on what kind of water they have in what we call a portfolio, right? So Central Arizona cities, they have different portfolios. Some of it is Colorado River water, some of it is reuse, some of it's groundwater, some of it comes from other river systems. So the Salt River Project delivers water. So there's a lot of different types of water that they have to sort of meet the needs of their communities. And so depending on how much Colorado River water a city relies on, that'll sort of dictate how they're responding, right, to this idea of being reduced. So the city of Yuma has a combination of priority 1 and priority 3 water. And their priority 3 water is the larger volume of water that they have. So they do have some priority 1. Most of it is priority 3. And so just like priority 3 ag users, there's a potential that the city might see a reduction. And I put the city's website up here, and I know it's hard to see in this room, and I can share that with anybody who wants it after the fact. But the city of Yuma has a web page, a dedicated web page that looks at what water conservation looks at, what their drought response plan is, and really talks about what they're doing, what you can do as a resident of the city of Yuma to save water. And they provide a lot of other resources for you to look at when you're doing that. So I don't work for them. I don't work with them, but that I did review that webpage, and it does have quite a bit of information. So if you want to know more about what you can do as a resident of the city to reduce your water, you can go there, and they have all of that information up on that site. And with that, I think Amanda and I are going to take questions for anybody that has questions in the audience. And I think, you guys want this microphone?
Well, you can keep that mic.
Entity, or is that like just the lower basins or lower and upper, or?
Yes. So the Bureau of Reclamation is one of the agencies under the Department of Interior.
Okay.
So it's a federal agency, and they have, just like any government bureaucracy, right? They have Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, there's regional offices, we have a local office here, but it's a federal entity.
In speaking with people about this previously, the way it was explained to me is basically the upper basin has no control. It's because there's so limited flow. It's basically they're not touching it much just to make sure they're meeting the requirement for the lower basins. And then it's kind of two lines of effort at the same time, right? The lower basins are trying to figure it out on their own so that the federal government doesn't have to figure it out for us. And then the federal government figuring out for us is really the Reclamation Bureau that's thinking through the problem at the same time. Is that the way to understand it?
Yeah, so it is important to distinguish sort of upper basin challenges versus lower basin challenges. You kind of want to think of it, I guess, like a bathtub drain, right? So in the upper basin, they're dealing with rain and snow, runoff from snow. So it's going to run through their rivers and their creeks, right, and their lakes and all these different things that they have. And it sort of runs down into different reservoirs, but ultimately it runs into Lake Powell. And that's sort of the end of that's the bathtub drain, right? It all runs there. And so they don't really enjoy the same benefit as the lower basin in that we're more like a sink, right? We say we have this right to water. We turn on the tap and they release the water from Lake Mead and it makes its way to us, right? And then we get to use it. And for that reason, we highly, we regulate it, we measure it, we have a really easy way of measuring it. And so we really just, we turn on the water, the water comes out, and we deliver that based on our system of rights and how much water everyone's supposed to get. In the upper basin, they really just sort of have to rely on the water that's there. So if it doesn't rain in a year, then their creeks, that run by their farms may be dry, or by their houses. And same thing with their rivers. And so their argument or their position, right, because maybe there's some argument there that it could be used better, or, right, everyone has their arguments to be made. But theirs is that, well, we've already been dealing with climate change or with drought response because if the water's not there, we don't use it, right? And we capture water in our reservoirs to make sure we can meet our obligations to the lower basin. But otherwise, we've done what we can do because we're essentially just using what we have. Yeah. And reclamation, like I said, other than telling them how much water they have to make sure gets delivered to the lower basin, reclamation has no say there. But they do highly regulate the lower basin, and part of that is because it's easier to regulate, right? We know what we get, and now it's just become an issue because there's not as much water available. So it is important to understand that, because I think that people think, hey, upper basin, like, you just do the same things that we do and we're gonna, all solve the problem together. And it's not that simple. But they will have to be part of whatever agreement we make moving forward. because it does affect some of their rights or obligations in the upper basin.
Thank you. Last question. So in conversations that I've had, I never got to see that chart, which was pretty alarming, or I guess eye-opening. So if you create a metric off of the highest time in history over 2,000 years, then obviously that metric is invalid. So why is it not as simple as, if we're seeing 12.4 million foot acres per year, 6, 6, and 0 is 12, which at least is a starting point. And that leads me to the follow-on question is, what is 1.5 million foot acres per year? What kind of effect does that have? It's kind of for both of you, right? What kind of effect does that have on state, federal, ag, all the things we use in Yuma County? Is that a big deal, or is that not a big deal? Because it seems like a very simple answer to the question.
Okay, so I'm going to take the first part. The first part is, why do we not just adjust those volumes that we've given to the upper and lower basin and each state? Because there are a lot of legal rights that have been created, and there are people that have relied on those rights for however long that it's been. And there is an unwillingness to give up a right that we believe we have, right? And I think Yuma would make the same argument, and maybe even a stronger argument, because we feel like we've been using it longer. So I think yes, sometimes those solutions sound really easy, and then by human nature and legal structures and all of those things, that's not where we find ourselves in trying to make those decisions. So that's where we're at. And then I'm going to pass the mic to Amanda to talk about what impacts a reduction would have.
So to your point, that is a concept that I think some people think need to be considered, is just cut every user by 20%. And then we'll get to where we can maintain it. But like Meghan said, there's the law of the river. And so that the law of the river would then be ignored if that was the way we went. Agriculture is the largest user of Colorado River water. But what we produce with that is all the food you eat, the food and the fiber that we use in our daily lives. So I talked about some of what that would mean to Yuma's agriculture. It would mean we would not be able to produce as much food. It means that the cost of food would go up, which, like I mentioned about food insecurity, that's already a problem in our country, and that would only get worse. Yuma has spent 140 years becoming the most efficient user of Colorado River water there is. And we have invested in water conservation on our farms, and we are down to where we almost can't get any better, because we've been doing this for 140 years. So it's really hard to cut anything out of what we're doing right now, or what we're using right now, to get any more efficient.
And I'll just add, from a municipal side, at least for the city of Yuma, we have our entitlements, right, to river water. And because we've been really good about managing our growth to some extent, right? It's also 120 here, and not a lot of people want to live here during the summer and things like that. But we've been able to manage our growth. We manage where it goes, right? Where our growth goes in ways where we don't sort of conflict with agriculture production and things like that. And we've managed our water resource pretty well. We don't use our full entitlement as a city. And so there's some room there, right? So we talked about seeing reductions. What that reduction impact will depend on how much they are cutting everybody. But it is, I guess, good for people to know that the city of Yuma does have some wiggle room, right? And depending on where you live, you may be using groundwater, and so that might not impact you at all. So those are just some things, we don't want to create panic, right? The city would probably be mad at me if they heard us make a bunch of statements that had everybody nervous and running out of here and calling the city. But they are things to think about, and from an ag perspective, it's important to think about because that's going to end up impacting our community from an economic standpoint. So no one needs to panic, but we need to be thinking about it, right? And starting to think about how we're going to conserve and react to whatever those reductions are.
How many other cities and communities take water or get water from the Colorado River besides Yuma?
So north of us, right, there's Parker and Kingman, and I believe Quartzsite maybe had a right to Colorado River water, but maybe has never used it. So I mean, as you go up, if you go north from us and you follow sort of the river, then a lot of those cities have rights to Colorado River water. And then through the Central Arizona project, there are a lot of Central Arizona cities that also have a Colorado River right through contracts with Central Arizona project. So there are quite a few cities, and like I said, they all have different portfolios of water. The city of Yuma in particular is a little bit more sensitive to reductions because the Colorado River is really its primary source of water. We don't have a lot of other options because, like I mentioned, our groundwater in a lot of places we're pumping Colorado River water, and so we're not allowed to sort of do that. If we're being reduced over here, surface water, we can't just go put in a well over here and pump it because reclamation will come and say, hey, you're not supposed to be you're not supposed to be doing that because you're using Colorado River water. So certain cities, especially along the river, were a lot more sensitive to those reductions. Central Arizona has a lot more. Those cities have quite a few more options, and they have their own problems, right? Like their infrastructure might not be ready for it, or they may not have the piping in line to bring water from over here to over here. And so they have their own challenges. I don't want to make it sound like it's easy for them to fix the problem. But they're going to have to start doing that, right? And some of them aren't. But every city will have its own unique challenges in addressing that. We're just a little bit more sensitive because of our location.
Are some weeds useful? Are some weeds useful?
Are some weeds useful in helping conserve water? Weeds? Did you say weeds? Her question was, are some weeds useful in helping conserve water? Or weeds? Like W-E-E-D?
So we consider anything that is growing in our field that we did not plant, that we are not intentionally growing there, to be a weed. And weeds can use your resources that are intended for the crop. So if we put on water, if we put on fertilizer, things like that, those weeds, because we don't want them there and they're not supposed to be there, can actually use those resources. So we do spend a lot of time and energy making sure our fields are super clean, and that includes not having weeds in them for that reason.
You mentioned reductions happening. Are we still using more water than Colorado River has?
Yeah, I think the question was, are we still using more water than the Colorado River has? Yes. We are using more water than what is coming into the Colorado River. We still have water that is stored in our reservoirs at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, but those levels are dropping and they continue to drop, and now we're at levels that are really scary. At some point we will get to a level where the water can't be brought out, can't leave those dams anymore. That level is considered dead pool. So we still have water. But the situation is getting worse because we don't have as much coming into the system as we are pulling out.
Thank you again so much for coming, and I'm panicking right now. No, I'm not really panicking, but it is scary. Like on one hand, it can, there's a lot of information, but I think as you absorb it, it's like, what's more important than water? So obviously it's such a huge issue. But a couple things I'm thinking, one, just based off of what you said just now, and obviously there's a lot of assumptions that will be made, but if things continue the way they're going as far as rainfall and usage, about how many more years do we have left before we reach that dead pool stage or where we can't pull water out of the reservoirs? And then secondly, for the average person in this room that might not be a farmer or might not, you use huge quantities of water. Obviously, we can do small things around our house, but what do you think we can do to help with this situation, whether it's literally things we do to conserve water or reaching out to politicians or, any suggestions on that?
So from the standpoint of how many years we have left, I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm sure someone's done the math, right? There's someone whose brain works like that. I tell people I went to law school, so I don't have to do math, right? And then I have to look at modeling and charts all day when I look at the Colorado River. But so I'm sure someone's done that math. I don't know how many years that we would have combined with combining runoff, right, or inflow into the system and what we have left in storage. So I don't know what that is, but I would say that as those inflow numbers are less, right, then we're using more of our storage. And that's sort of the issue or the problem that we're finding ourselves in, is that we've had to use more of our storage because our inflows have been less. And as we use that storage, then it's just not going to be there. Amanda mentioned dead pool, and one of the biggest concerns with sort of emptying our storage to meet our needs is that we have really old but strong infrastructure that's been in place forever, right? And as we get to dead pool, we are not generating power anymore, which is a big issue. I'm sure you guys have seen to some extent that your power bills are going up, and power will only continue to be more expensive as we're not generating power at those facilities. So Glen Canyon Dam at Lake Powell and also Hoover Dam at Lake Mead. So we put the infrastructure at risk. We put power generation at risk. And so there's really not a desire by the Bureau of Reclamation to get us to a point where we're at dead pool or things like that. So a big part of the conversation is sort of setting these elevations at these lakes that we're going to protect no matter what. And that means that if releasing that water means it's going to go below that elevation, the federal government's just not going to do it. And so it's really that math between inflow. And some years we have good inflow, right? Most years we don't lately. So those are kind of the considerations that are there. But we're talking about seeing reductions in deliveries in 2024. How big those reductions will look like and who's going to see them, those are the answers that we don't have yet. And then, do you have ideas for what people can do?
I would refer you back to Megan's slide on the city of Yuma. They have a plan. They, I think, are in the first stages of that plan, which includes a lot of education. I think education is going to be a huge part of this. That's why I agreed to come here today, and I'm so glad to see all of you here today. But when people understand the problem, I think they're more willing to make those hard decisions that it's going to take to conserve water. And like I already mentioned, it's going to take every water user to do that, to fix this problem. But there are different stages in that plan, and I don't want to talk about it because it's not my plan. But there are things that you already mentioned. watering your lawn and maybe not overseeding in the wintertime and taking shorter showers. And, there's lots of things that we can all do to help. And, I would just refer you to that plan for some more ideas.
Awesome. Oh, is this on, Max? Is this on? Well, it is 11, and so I respect all of your time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. But if we could just give one more round of applause to our speakers.